Greetings, everyone. My name is Adil Najm. I am the Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies here at Boston University. It is wonderful to have you all here with us, although sorry that we are doing this over Zoom rather than in person, and looking forward to when we can be getting back to that. But greetings from Bay State Road here at Boston University. I'm looking out my window as I look at my screen with a nearly frozen over Charles there. So welcome all. Welcome all to this alumni event. We are going to be talking in this webinar about deforestation. That's a very big topic, and we'll be looking at some of the challenges and opportunities around that topic and what it means for now and what it means for the future. Our speakers are eager to listen from you and to your ideas and to engage in those ideas. So as you listen to them, please do take notes, and if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box down there, and we will have a way of them having a look at them and engage you in that conversation. Having said that, let me introduce our wonderful panel. We have two speakers today, both of whom know a lot about the subject of forests and deforestation, and will be talking with you. I am delighted to be joined by my colleague of many years, Les Kaufman. Les is a professor in the BU Marine program at the College of Arts and Sciences, and is an evolutionary ecologist who studies basic processes that drive creation, collapse, and conservation of the aquatic species diversity on coral reefs and tropical Great Lakes. His interests are increasingly turned towards clinical research on the dynamics of human-natural coupled systems to create supporting science for global sustainability and climate change adaptation. As of late, he's been publishing for his research regarding pandemic prevention and tropical forest biology. So a lot there on a lot of aspects of deforestation and of forests and sustainability in general. Now, we are also joined by an alumni colleague here. Anukul Lakhina is an alumnus of BU's College of Arts and Sciences and is the co-founder of Wonder Labs, a social enterprise catalyzing social and ecological social enterprise that catalyzes social and ecological innovations with communities on the front line of climate impacts. He is the founder and CEO of BurnBot Inc., a startup focused on scaling dead fuel treatment to prevent mega fires, and a partner at Connective Capital, a fire tech focused venture fund. He has more than 2 decades of thought leadership in large-scale data analytics, and in 2015 received BU's Computer Science Distinguished Alumni Award. So a lot of expertise here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them and joining them in this conversation. My own work is on climate change in general, and particularly in developing countries. And particularly from the aspect of climate adaptation and what it means to human development within developing countries across the globe. So with that, let me just jump right into the conversation with that big bold question, and I will start with Les, if that is okay. Which is, if you think about deforestation, there's a lot there, but what would you say in your mind is or are amongst the most important challenges or most important opportunities that we should be thinking about when we think about this huge topic? Les.
Well, thanks, Adil. I mean, to me, the issue of deforestation is emblematic of our whole relationship with nature and the existential crises that we face individually and as a society. Obviously, it's related to climate change because a huge amount of the carbon that gets pulled out of the atmosphere is pulled down by trees and put into a sequestered form. As long as we don't burn it, it helps with the climate. The forests have the highest density of species on Earth, and that includes both terrestrial species and fishes and things living in the rivers and streams through the forest. And so it is a way of dealing directly with the issue of mass extinction. If we can reconcile our relationship with forests, especially but not only tropical forests, we deal with a huge proportion of the mass extinction problem. Tropical forests are ground zero for dealing with human inequities. A lot of the world's poor live there, make a living there. You can't just tell them to stop. And how we deal with burgeoning overpopulation in these precious natural systems that help support the rest of the earth, that's one of our grand challenges. And finally, just dealing with the general decline of nature and loss of all the things we get from nature by creating new lifestyles that are harmonious with natural systems, perhaps not in a pristine state. We're not going to go back to what they were before, but in a state compatible with human well-being. So these are enormous challenges. We can't just kind of talk about them and they go away. And so I see deforestation as kind of a cardinal issue, like the head of a wedge. If we can deal with that, we go a long way toward assuring our own future.
Thank you, Les. Thank you for that, both for the succinctness, but also for pinpointing, some of these grand challenges. And I'm particularly glad you mentioned the issue of lifestyles, because in many ways that I think is and will be the key idea that we will have to grapple with. And when I say we, I really mean we, not just governments. Because in some ways, this question that somehow we will speak about it and the problem will go away, or government or someone else will make it go away without me changing how I live, is one of those fundamental lies that we have created in recent days. But having said that, and coming back to this later, Anukul, I see you smiling. Tell us what you think. Building on what Les said, but even if not, when you see this question of forests, which is an area you work in, what do you see as the great big challenges of our times and opportunities?
Yeah, I appreciate that. My journey in this space really came from a personal experience, because we lived through the wildfires here in California, and it was really through that experience. And as I started studying, why are these things happening? How do we manage them? How do we live and reimagine our relationship with nature? As Les was saying, I realized that wildfires are just a symptom. The broader issue is really forest health, and you can't be thinking about forest health without putting them in the context of our overall planet health. So, the roles, as Les was mentioning, the roles that forests play, the lungs of the earth. If you will, that's an expression that's often used. And like Les was saying, the connections between forest health and climate is obvious and apparent, simply because the only technology that we have to be able to take excess carbon out of the atmosphere is photosynthesis, and our forests and our trees really play that role. And so what's happened is, essentially, with deforestation, we've created open spaces, which are also ripe for wildfires. But then also with increasing warming climate and an excess of dead fuel, we're seeing more and more wildfires occur more and more frequently, which are larger and more destructive. So roughly about a quarter of our 4 billion hectares of forest are lost to wildfires annually. And so essentially what we have done is we have taken something that is a sink that is supposed to suck carbon out, and we have made it an emitter, now generating carbon out into the atmosphere. So it's, the cynic in me, scoff said this because it's a prime example of human terra engineering gone wrong, each one kind of optimizing for its local decision. But from a systems perspective, this has been a failure. Like I said, we've taken a sink and made it into largely a net contributor of our emissions. And I think that's where the opportunity really is. In my view, it's easy to kind of just slide into the sky is falling, doom and gloom. But I think, as you were also mentioning, Adil, you can't kind of outsource this problem to something that we talk about and magically the governments come and do something. I think by taking a systems view to the problem and by thinking end to end and really recognizing the role that forests play in the overall climate landscape, one can start reimagining new ways to think about this. And once you take that approach, I feel one can start imagining new incentives, new economics, new models, and take a much more breadth approach, not just isolating governments to do the job, but also NGOs, private companies, individuals, us in our behavior, our social behavior, whether it's consumption of excess meat, for example, or it is, working downstream with communities and helping them reimagine their relationship with fire as well as with forests. So I actually am optimistic that it is not it is a challenging situation that we find ourselves in, because every year is unprecedented. But I don't think this is something that we have to just raise our hands and surrender to it. I think it's a challenging problem, but one, if we apply ourselves and take a kind of multi-pronged approach, this is something that we can make a dent in. Just the other day, I was reading a report by the BCG, which kind of put the economic value, if one can put that on forests, at $150 trillion. I mean, that in comparison, our entire stock market is half of that. Gold is like 1/10 of that. So it does tell you what the role that forests play, not only in terms of the economic value from kind of forest products, but also the role that they play in climate, the role that they play in our personal relationship as well. So all to say, I think we find ourselves in a very kind of critical time, but I don't think this is one where one should just surrender and hide. I think this is one where we should kind of catalyze ourselves and go and address it. So,
and certainly we shouldn't be surrendering. But Anukul, if I can keep with you for a moment, and I'll come to less later, but and maybe invite you to say something a little bit more also on what is the role for technology here. And I was particularly taken by your pointing out this sort of view that has come about. The forest was supposed to be a sink, which is as if the whole planet was designed for us, and our role was to sort of spew out guck, and the rest of nature was supposed to take it in, whether the oceans or forests. I'm not sure we ever asked the trees if that's their purpose of being. But having said all of that, and where we are today, in this sort of very human-dominated use of the planet, what role does technology play, especially given that very often technology has been seen or was seen as part of the problem, and the part of either the problem itself or something that accelerates the problem? So how do you see a more different role for technology into the future?
Yeah, I mean, technology, can be, what's the expression? Technology is neither good nor bad, but the application of it makes it such. I think that when you're thinking about, when you're trying to take a systems approach to solving kind of vexing, wicked problems, I think technology has a role to play in creating new frameworks. And I think one valuable framework to use when we think about deforestation or climate is to take a disaster risk reduction approach, because in many ways that is where we are at. We are facing kind of compounding disasters. And so if you take a lens of, okay, how do you reduce the risk? You can take the lens of where can you prevent, where can you mitigate, where can you detect and respond, where can you adapt and recover. So if you take that approach, then you can imagine kind of technologies playing a role in each of those. I mean, beginning with something very basic as just sensing, using remote sensing, satellite data to understand where is there deforestation happening, understand where are the carbon sinks kind of disappearing. And in fact, I mean, a shout out to BU. BU has some great assets in remote sensing, whether you look at Mark Friedel's work in arts and sciences or whatnot. So I feel like BU actually has been the leading edge when it comes to using remote sensing and airborne LiDAR type technology to understand our forests. And that itself is opening up new markets. For example, there are some really interesting technology companies that are now allowing forest owners another income stream through monetizing their carbon assets in carbon markets. So in other words, if the only stream of revenue I would get from my forest is through timber harvesting, now I have another option that if I do not harvest my timber, I can actually get credits for keeping the carbon where it rightfully belongs. I think there's also a lot of technologies that are really trying to mimic or scale nature-based approaches. I mean, the one area that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is really in the area of wildfires. And if you think about it, there is something called good fire. The Native Americans used to use good fire 13,000 years ago to actually take out dead fuel. And you know, if you could ecologically take out that dead fuel, then when you would have large fires, they wouldn't be catastrophic in nature. So for example, there is a very good application of technology where you take something that's an indigenous practice going back 13,000 years ago, and then adapting it to the modern 21st century by scalably using good fire to prevent our communities, prevent our landscapes, prevent our property and habitat from mega fire damage. And that actually is a company that that's BurnBot in a nutshell, you know, where we're really using fire to scale fuel treatment to remove this dead fuel. So, I mean, all to say, you know, I think technology can play a varied lens across that disaster risk reduction spectrum that I was talking about, whether it be in detection and monitoring, whether it be in, you know, preventing or mitigating. And again, all to say, you know, my thesis is that climate technology for climate overall is going to be, I think, let's use the word grand challenge. You know, I feel like just like when finance first came out, right, in the 1980s, and all the brains kind of went to finance, I feel like this generation, you know, if we can, if there is one message that I have, right, I believe there's lots of alumni, they might have kids going to school, like climate and tech, I think that's going to be the next trillionaires, the next great companies that will get created in that space. So I'm a big believer in using technology to both prevent as well as adapt to these compounding crises that we face.
Thanks, and I'll come back to you on this technology question and where is the balance? What are the things we should be sort of where is the payoff, and what are the places where we ought to be careful about it? And I'm sure our colleagues who are watching will also. Once again, a reminder to those of you who are watching, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. But you want to take the discussion from exactly where we have it and take it to the other grand challenges that you already mentioned. You mentioned, you know, the role of forest and climate in terms of the mass extinctions, in terms of inequity of disease, in particular in these days of COVID. That's something you've also been working on. And on population, I'll also want to push you later. But where do forests place themselves in these other grand challenges as one of those sort of calibrators of what's happening on the planet at planetary scales? Les.
Sure. Well, we talked about climate change, but in terms of mass extinction, I don't know if people are aware that we've already entered a period of time when the loss of species has exceeded the rate that it was at when the dinosaurs went extinct. I mean, if you think about it, that's incredible. That's the equivalent of a 10-mile wide rock hitting the earth. So that's humanity, a 10-mile wide rock. And really what's required to deal with that is to preserve enough of the core forest, what we call, well, wilderness forest, as possible, but without discounting the enormous value of humanized forest, a forest with people in it. So I completed a study recently with a grad student of ours, Xiaosheng Ma, and my colleague Suchi Gopal, in which we did some of the things that we were recommending. We used remote sensing to characterize the physical structure and extent of forests in Southeast Asia. And this is some of the world's most hyper-diverse and human high-value forest. And what we discovered is that in areas that I had been walking around on the ground and looking for elephants only a few years ago in Cambodia, there was actually zero core forest remaining. In other words, zero forest far enough from the edge that we could be assured of it maintaining its ecology and all of its species, far enough apart from human influence. And this was shocking because some of this forest I had been inside of, and I was unaware of the extent to which it had been permeated by human influence. Now, what that sets up is this idea, really more of a solution, Adil, than going into the problems in greater detail. If we imagine our forest estate as a machine with certain requirements, we need core forest or wilderness forest. That's forest that's wider than, say, 5 or 10 kilometers. But then around it, a forest buffer where it is managed by people in their either traditional or modified livelihoods so that it delivers its maximum value to people. And we have a model for this. In Central America, the Mayan people completely reimagined the forest. And what we call a primary forest there is actually a garden of trees, of useful trees. So it's actually possible to create a young, fast-growing, rapidly sequestering carbon forest with enormous utility to people as a buffer around the wilderness forest. And then imagine another ring around that of a humanized landscape where there's agriculture and animal husbandry and some trees. And then finally, the peri-urban and urban environment. What we need is these sort of, I don't want to call them isolates because they need to be big enough, but it's like Ed Wilson's half Earth. But instead of drawing a line around the earth and saying, here's the half that's nature and here's the half that's people, what we're doing is learning how to integrate society and the natural system so they're mutually supportive.
So can I push back? I very much admire what you're doing and resonate with it. But especially when you mentioned half Earth, there have been a bunch of these ideas that we need to sort of quote unquote preserve a certain part of the planet away from human interference or in a more pristine, what you're calling primary sort of and one, folks like Vandana Shiva and others might sort of push back and say that part of our desire to manage planet Earth is to stop seeing ourselves as a species, but in a view where other species are species, we are something special for whom this planet has been ordained, and we shall now manage the planet and the species so that it can sustain us. And I sometimes think the dinosaurs might have been thinking the same of that period that you reminded us was very similar to this in terms of species extinctions. So I'm trying to be provocative here, but I do want to raise this thought to you and then maybe later to Anukul also. What is our role as a species, if indeed we are, or are we a super species whose role is to sort of manage? We are now so strong as a species that we are going to ordain the organization of other species on the planet. I'm trying to be provocative here.
Yeah, no, great. First of all, we're just a species like any other, except for one thing, our special superpower. And that is to imagine futures, to anticipate way into the future. And this is really just self-serving. We can easily imagine a future where we've destroyed so much of nature that we have to take over the job that nature was doing to provide a life support system for ourselves. And that's ridiculously expensive.
I agree, but just to again, or nature is smiling there, listening to us and saying, no, you won't destroy us. I'll be fine. You'll be gone.
Right.
I've seen others come and go. I'll see you guys come and go too.
Exactly. But with that wisdom, we can now imagine a future that's actually viable.
Yeah, and didn't mean to cut you, but I think that's really the point, and I hope we can open up a discussion with our participants too. That's really the point. If we are a species with superpower, which Les is exactly right. In some ways, this is a species that has grown so great in its power that it itself doesn't fully understand just how awesome in a true way that power can be to destroy that on which it itself depends. Right, Les? Anupul, on the same sort of thought, but coming back to sort of California and the fires that you pointed out, uh, tell us a bit more about what are the impact of these uncontrolled fires? What does it mean for you in California and others? And then we extrapolate it to, what Les was also saying. Forests is where people live. A lot of the world's population depends on these resources.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I think the
but
first
fine.
point to note is it's not that the wildfires that happen here in California or anywhere happen out there, and the rest of the world can kind of move on, because we've already seen that the smoke from fires. I mean, the Australia fires, the smoke went around the world a couple of times. The 2020 fires here in California that smoked us all out. They were in New York, in a matter of hours, days. So the effects just on a very personal level, you can feel it. And only now people are starting to realize that this smoke is actually toxic. It can create severe issues, especially in children. So, the damages of wildfire are clear. Here in California, insurance is basically, if you live in what's called a fire risk area, which is about 3 out of every 4 homes in California, you're essentially kind of insured out, or you live one fire away from being insured out. So there's a property damage. There's, as Les was mentioning, there's a species destruction. Because when these fires come in, they don't discriminate. They just come and destroy it. And of course, there's a habitat loss as well. 18% of our global emissions now come from wildfires, which, if you think about it, is a pretty staggering statistic. And it also tells us that if we can prevent these fires, we can maybe make a dent in that 18% of emissions long enough for us to transition out of a fossil fuel kind of era, if you will. But if we don't do anything about these fires, they'll continue to kind of wreak havoc. They'll continue to destroy people, property, habitat, and the like. So I don't think fires are any more a local issue that kind of happens out there in the forest. They're now happening in our communities. Colorado had its most destructive fire in its entire history on New Year's Eve. And it was there weren't even forests around them. There was, previously deforested land where agriculture had happened and then had been abandoned. And then you had all this dead fuel, and all it took was a few embers with crazy winds. And because you had such dead fuel around, entire towns got devastated. So we average, at least in the US, 2 to 3 towns that get destroyed every year. And every year, the adjective that's used is unprecedented, which is getting a little old, because it's no longer unprecedented if that's what happened last year and that's what happened the year before. So that was what kind of was a wake-up call for me personally to kind of jump in this space, because I don't see the problem. It's that proverbial frog, where you keep increasing the temperature and the frog is kind of blissfully aware. In this case, the frog is a super species that you were talking about, Adil, and we're blissfully unaware. Oh, it's just another year. And then, our attention span is, oh, it happened now. There's fire season. Then, 3 months later, we'll forget about it. But now even the fire season, it's burning in winter. Like I mentioned, Colorado in January here, we had fires. So there isn't any more like fires in the summertime. There are fires that are going on all the time. So the fire historians call it the Pyrocene. It's like the Ice Age, going back to our dinosaur example, Ice Age, but on fire. So this is a problem that is a natural. It's one of those 4 dark horsemen of climate change. The wildfires are the first one. So going back to what Les was saying, if we can reimagine our relationship with fire, if we can reimagine our relationship with forest, we can do something about tackling this first dark horseman at least.
So, but right on that, let's take Les's challenge here. If our superpower as a species is the ability to imagine a future that is different and then actualize it, how and I throw that challenge, Les's challenge, to you in terms of fire, especially, let's just take California. What do you imagine? What do you see, and how?
Yeah, I think it begins with we can actually we can borrow liberally from how the indigenous people kind of manage this. We can learn from what they did. Of course, that doesn't really apply in the 21st century when we have built our homes and built our communities in these areas of wildland urban interface. But we can take ideas from there and we can apply it. So whether it be in terms of dramatically changing how we do fuel treatment. And that's something that, over the last 2 years, it has really kind of taken shape. The federal government has put in, $50 billion over a 10-year plan to kind of create these fire sheds, similar to less what you were talking about, right? Around pristine forests, kind of create these areas where they're free of dead trees, because here in California, you have an epidemic of dead trees, you've got beetle infestations, and then you have dead fuel. So you've got all these three things coming together to make our forests more vulnerable than they ever have been. So in terms of solutions, I think it begins with, first of all, kind of reimagining what our relationship with fire is and recognizing that these are fire adapted landscapes. They do need fire. So once you start with that recognition, then you can say, okay, how do we bring that Native American practice into the 21st century? How do we do more prescribed burning? How do we do more controlled burning? And how do we do it safely so that the smoke from these prescribed fire or the escape risk from these prescribed fires do not affect our communities? So this is where I think technology can play a role, taking a practice which is a nature-based solution and then adapting it to the 21st century so that it's ready for a world that we live in today, where, as I mentioned, we have homes and we have, lifestyle choices that people have made that have them living near forests. We have our roads and our railroads and our power lines kind of cutting through these forests. So given that that's already there and we can't change it, given that we can't really change climate overnight, at least not for next fire season, then the one variable that we do have in control is to kind of take out fuel. And that's an area I think that will start getting more and more attention as we grapple with this compounding crisis.
Continuing on that, Les, but before I come to you again, requesting and asking our colleagues who are watching, we have a healthy audience here. If you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A section, but do put them in the Q&A, not the chat. I don't see anything there yet, but we'll keep an eye out. Les, same sort of thought starting from what you had said, and about sort of our power to imagine, but also that, forests are not just a clump of trees. N number of trees don't make a forest. Forests are living beings in themselves that serve a purpose much greater than whatever trees do. And you have worked a lot also and talked a lot about sort of the importance of mature forests and sort of living forests that serve a purpose and are sometimes sort of not talked about as much. So can you say a bit about that and why it is important to think of mature forests, what they do, and how we can create the economic incentives to maintain what they do, which is important?
Yeah, Adil, a mature forest is a forest generally at whatever latitude. Generally, it's a forest that's more than 500 years old. Although forests begin to acquire these, what we call old growth characteristics after only 100 years. And what's different about a mature forest is that it controls its own climate. The trees are mature enough that they create a canopy that regulates the environment beneath it. And that environment is unlike any other on Earth. And it's one that fosters an enormous diversity of life because of its reliability, because that environment is there year after year. And so that things can evolve and be able to rely on the continued existence of very specific resources. The other thing about a mature forest is that it's hard to burn. You need to build up an enormous amount of fuel outside the mature forest in order to penetrate and destroy it. And that's part of the beauty of what Anukul was talking about, to regulate the fuel supply in the forest surrounding this mature forest so that it can't burn into the center of it. And that also, of course, makes it more hospitable to things like high value real estate, because people want to live in the forest. The other thing about mature forest is it produces a diversity of useful things. The most important of all in this era are genes. Nature has figured out how to do all kinds of cool stuff that is really valuable to us, and that information is coded in this enormous diversity of species. And we can borrow that insight to create synthetic processes that do the same thing. The other thing about mature forest to keep in mind, though, is that when it disentangles, when it falls apart, Pandora's box is opened. And all kinds of organisms that are harmless and useful in the context of an intact forest are potentially lethal once they escape. The best example of that are things like COVID-19, the virus that causes it. Viruses are actually not all evil. Think of viruses like a cloud of genetic information that surrounds the rest of the living world and that carries genes from one organism to another. It's a very bizarre thought, but we're starting to realize that's the case. When you rent the fabric of the forest, these viruses that are existing in a controlled state within the context of the forest, they get out, they get into our livestock and eventually into us, where the advantage for them is to become virulently pathogenic. And that's what we're seeing. So by maintaining an intact forest, we not only preserve value, we avert catastrophe. Now, the one thing, Adil, can I just say one thing more? We're talking, I'm a big proponent, obviously, of technology and of science, but most of human society doesn't train as scientists. They don't fully understand what science is about, but you know what they do understand? Values, basic values. If we want to preserve things like the forest or nature's service and utility to people, the first thing we have to do is inculcate values that foster that. And that's something that a lot of indigenous societies still have, and we can learn from.
I have a question here from Ron Elowitz about exactly this. So let me put that to you, Les, which is reforestation, I guess, in general, and protection of mature forests in particular, something that should be tackled at the government level, at the state level, I'll add international level, or local level? And maybe what I'll add is, where is our role in all of this?
Well, we are citizens of the forest, just like our relative primates. I mean, our cousins who are still up in the trees. So it's really at every level that this has to happen. What governments can do and governance systems is provide incentives that inculcate the values that we're talking about, values that sustain the human enterprise. But ultimately, it's up to individuals and how they live from day to day to instantiate the values, the regulations, the laws that all tend to move society forward in a sustainable way.
And Anukul, building on that, but the same question from Ron, we talk at least in the media and even ourselves, about these forest fires as the immediate danger, as we should, to our homes, to our children, to our health, to the climate also. But how does all of this impact the diversity of the forests themselves, the species within them? And any thoughts on that? But I'll also add the question that was being asked of Les. What do you see as our role? Who are the prime actors, and what should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, the statistics are actually kind of mind-boggling. I think in the Australia fire, there was 1 billion animals that were devastated or destroyed with the fires. So, oftentimes we don't even know the full figure because the havoc can be pretty tremendous. So there is a very direct link between fires and species destruction, and that link isn't kind of fading away. But coming to your point, coming to the question that Ron asked, I don't think this is just one where we leave the government. Of course, governments can and are and should be playing a role, whether it be in boosting afforestation, clarifying and enforcing land ownership, and supporting the long-term use of adaptive land planning. But it's not just government. I actually think the private sector and consumers can play a pretty vital role. Private sector, we're already seeing forward-leading corporations investing and buying carbon through carbon markets. And I think that's a really interesting financial incentive where you have Microsoft and Amazon and Google actually going in and saying, hey, we will take money and we will make sure that these forests remain untouched. And from there, we will actually, the carbon that we can help preserve is something that we'll get credits against. So that's an area, whether you're investing in forests or you're implementing and reporting on forests, or even if you're developing products that are supply chain clean, if you will, right? So I think private corporations can play a role. I think consumers can play a role as well as we think about the deforestation problem, whether it's to consume certified products, whether they be, forest risk timber, or to recycle or reuse and alleviate the demand that would be there on, fresh wood, for example, or even something as changing or being mindful of our own consumption, shifting towards more plant-based, I think can play a pretty vital role as well as we think about deforestation. So these are all, I think, dimensions of the problem. And I don't think it's something that we should take as taxpayers. This is something that government should take care of, because I think the effect.
I'm going to go to Les and Anukul. If you could also check your mic, there was a little sort of your sound. I could hear you, but not as well as we could otherwise. So I don't know if it's just you or the whole system here. But Les, to continue on this climate issue, climate has become one of the defining ecological issues of our times, but also a very defining policy and political question of our time. So everything gets sort of wrapped in that. You said already a bunch of things very important about sort of how to look at forests in the age of climate change, but I wanted to invite you to say more, including about maybe about sort of what Anukul said, which is very important, so I can, as a corporation or even individual, say, I'm going to help preserve this tree or forest so that it can be certified that this much emissions are reduced. But in some ways, we are still trapped in saying, okay, therefore, I am now going to not reduce my own emissions because I've just bought this right to pollute that much because I'm nice to this tree. And the challenge there is that tree is a reservoir of carbon eventually and gets burned down or something else. And then you're left with a double whammy. I never changed my behavior, and what was supposedly this nice behavior by me was essentially buying a right to pollute. I'm again being provocative here, but in these existential times, how do you view on this or other things? Thinking how should we be thinking of forests, not just trees, in the age of climate change?
Yeah, it's a tough one because what it requires is a better attention really to common pool resource, to common property of the entire world. I mean, it's hard for people to grasp, but what is going on in Brazil actually does have a direct and a durable impact on what's happening in North America or Europe. And what we need to do is set up a fair deal across the peoples of the world so that if we say, Brazil, you got to stop cutting your forest down because you're screwing us over. And we're somewhere 10,000 miles away. There has to be something in it for Brazil too in the short term. We have to balance short-term and long-term incentives. Actually, long-term incentives is almost an oxymoron because nobody thinks long-term. So, for example, I've seen it in Brazil. The Atlantic rainforest is one of the most endangered forests in the world. And one of the things that has, in our minds, threatened it was the growth of the paper industry there. They planted all these eucalyptus trees to make chopsticks and toilet paper and stuff like that. Well, our first reaction of the conservation community was horror. They're taking mature forest and replacing it with eucalyptus trees from Australia. Over the years, we learned that this can actually be done in a reasonable way, and that the eucalyptus forest managed properly can produce both that industry and its income and its jobs, and also provide corridors among patches of natural forest and help buffer them and preserve them. Under the forest trees in this kind of humanized forest, they grow cocoa in a special system of shade-grown cocoa and coffee. So a lot of these ideas have been figured out. They need to be implemented. And in order to implement them, we have to reimagine the distribution of wealth, and that's the tough part. Yeah.
Yeah, and reimagination is really the theme of today. I would highlight what Les said for our audience also. You know, forests are also not static. We sometimes sort of put on a pedestal what was as the ideal, but what was not always what it was. Right. I'm told, for example, I live here in Massachusetts, and every fall, everyone comes to look at the fall and the beautiful leaves and the colors. And that is not the colors that probably, you know, people saw at the first Thanksgiving, because forests evolve themselves, because the planet evolves. And what we are doing again with our superpower is forcing an evolution on the planet at a planetary scale because of our ability. But on that, I'll ask this to both of you, but start with Anukul. Susan Randall, who is listening to us and is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, says that her city is planting 1,000 trees a year in an effort to reforest the urban landscape. What are your thoughts on this type of initiatives? Anukul first.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all excellent initiatives, and you know, I think there's a Trillion Trees program. So I think the more we can do of this, the better it is. You know, there's also technologies now where you're using drones to do mass scale reforestation. Now, of course, with that, you need to make sure that you're not planting the trees too close to each other and the right kind of trees, and it's not invasive species and those kind of I would say technical concerns. But I actually feel like reforestation, afforestation, this is also an area where the government can play a role, whether it's incentivizing or supporting or clarifying and enforcing, you know. So I actually applaud these kind of initiatives, especially if they're done at a very local community level, because then that becomes sustainable in its own way. It also kind of allows you to imagine different kind of circular economies from forests themselves. So I do think that kind of taking this community level approach has some very sound benefits that could be lasting and sustainable.
And I'll come to Les. In some ways, I'm thinking of listening to you, Anukul, and thinking, and maybe we all need to think of ourselves as forest people. For this very little period in human history, we've removed the forest from our life as if it's something out there, as opposed to remembering that we are actually all forest people. This is a much forested planet, not entirely so, and we have thrived as a species in it. But Les might tell me I'm wrong on that, and I'll be happy to take that. But Les, the question I did want to throw at you was from Ron again, who asks about the Amazon and says, are there other than the Amazon forested regions that are particularly vulnerable to deforestation around the globe? Because we all hear about the Amazon. I'll add a little anecdote to that, Les, as you think of your answer. Way back in 1992, when the World Earth Summit was happening, I was very active in that. And as you know, I work on international climate and environmental policy. And there was a lot of talk at that time. Jane Fonda had introduced this term, the Amazon is the lungs of our planet. And she thought it was cute. The Brazilians didn't. I recall the Brazilian Minister of Environment saying at a meeting of world leaders that how come, you know, when it's my forests, when it's your forest, it's your resource. When it's my forest, it's the lungs of the earth. So as you pointed out, there is an equity issue here. There is a cost issue here of who we ask to pay how much for responding to our pollution and so on and so forth. But any thoughts on this from Ron? We hear about the Amazon, but what are the other parts of the world that we should be also thinking of?
Well, I mean, they're really anywhere that there's mature forest remaining. I mean, tropical forest wise, the other big ones are the West African forest of the Congo Basin and the forests of Southeast Asia. But all of these tropical forests are down to the bone. And what we need to do is let the flesh regenerate around those tiny remnants that are remaining. We think of the Amazon or the Congo forest as vast, but now you look at it from satellite and it looks like Swiss cheese. You need to fill the holes back in. But it's not just tropical forest. There are some very, very precious forests that are kind of on their last legs. There is fantastic temperate rainforest all around the Pacific Rim at high latitude. Those forests are precious, and those are losing their character very quickly. They're being encroached. The boreal forest is the other vast forest on Earth. And it may be low diversity, but it's extraordinarily high function. And then why stop on land? I mean, the Amazon may be the left lung of the planet, but the oceans are the right lung and also half of the left lung. And we have to be careful about oxygen sourcing from the ocean, carbon dioxide being absorbed by the ocean. It's just a critical organ of the planet, and we're not paying heed. But there's another idea here, a very optimistic kind of view that we can adopt that I think is legitimate. And that goes back to Susan Randall's question. And that's, you know, are these afforestation projects good? Well, they're not just good, they're wonderful, but not just because we're planting trees. Imagine what we've done to the world forest estate as an opportunity. Those of us who are artists, you see a blank canvas or a piece of music ledger with no notes on it. It's an incredible opportunity to reinvent the image, the music, in a manner appropriate to tomorrow, not just today. So for example, the planting of trees in Michigan, our trees in North America are under siege because warmer winters have invited tree pests further north. We're losing our ash trees. We're losing our hemlock trees to predators that are now surviving where they hadn't before, diseases and insects. Well, we can reconstitute the forest so that it is more resistant to these changes, so that it is better adapted to the world we've inadvertently created. And we're doing that in the ocean too, by seeking out corals that are more resistant to climate change or more resilient in the face of it, and reconstituting coral reef communities that may be better able to recover from repeated climate assaults. So we are becoming an agent of evolution in a benevolent way, as long as we retain our humility, our understanding that we don't really get it all.
Yeah, no, humility is another word that I hope people will take from this conversation. Anukul, anything to add on that, including Peter Monti's question that was added just now, who asks also about wetlands, particularly the mangrove forests. I was last week, as you know, I was traveling, partly it was mangrove related in the Arabian Sea. And so any thoughts on sort of what Les said, and again, wanted to push this thing to what can we imagine should be done and how?
Yeah, I mean, just to answer Peter's question, absolutely. Wetlands, peatlands, these are all important assets. And I think that's the right kind of word to use to describe them. Although that does kind of, you know, make us the super species, I guess, Adil, to your, you know, your phrase. You know, we didn't really double click more on that. In many ways, we are the super species. Now, of course, part of having that that badge or that role is to be humble and to recognize that we don't actually understand how these systems work. We are still trying to figure out, you know, our understanding in the last 20 years has been dramatically accelerated with the advent of kind of sensing technologies from the sky and space. So we are at the point where we're starting to understand these things as systems. And, you know, we do have this incredible power of terra engineering our planet. So one has to be kind of judicious, mindful, careful, and humble when applying this incredible powers that we have. and hopefully play that role that Les was talking about, being benevolent agents of evolution. But I don't think it's unavoidable. I think whether or not, it's just how humanity is. I think we just have to accept it and then hopefully steer the course in the right way. I don't think we can wish away that we will not use this power. We already have it, and it's not getting smaller. It's only getting deeper.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And I think that's, at least to me, the point of the super species. It's accepting it is accepting the responsibility.
Exactly.
It is not a label, it is a responsibility. And that, I think, is what we are about in this conversation. Before we start wrapping up, Les, any thoughts on Peter's question about mangroves, wetlands?
About what? About mangroves?
Mangroves and
Yeah. I
wetlands.
want to put in a big shout out for mangroves. One of the beautiful things about mangroves is that when we are in the process of wrecking the land, we can actually grow the mangrove forests. When they trap this sediment that is coming down from degraded watersheds and put it into a more usable form. They build land and they store carbon, not just above the ground, but below the ground. Unlike tropical forests, the soil is a tremendous reservoir in mangrove swamps for carbon. And actually, I think of a place in Palau. I love Palau, but on the main island of Babelda, the southern part of the island, the mangrove forest has actually been growing. And part of it is probably an accident of a poorly built road, with sediments draining into the ocean. But the Palauans have come to recognize that this is something incredibly valuable. And it's a change they couldn't have anticipated. And they're going to take advantage of it, and they can get credit for those mangrove trees in their carbon balance.
As we wrap up, I wanted to again sort of remind folks of something that I think both of my guests had spoken about at various points. So there is a justice and equity issue here, and that's part of that humility. If we think about forests at a global level, then we have to think about responsibility at a global level. That thing I mentioned from Brazilians getting very antsy about sort of being this term lungs of the earth was entirely legitimate. It's entirely legitimate because we were pointing fingers at them. It's somehow your deforestation is your fault, right? And their response was, no, it's not our fault. We are the ones who kept our old forests. That's why you're talking about us today. And so much of the world that sort of just did away with them much earlier, or turned them into other sorts of resources, has a responsibility in thinking about it as a global resource, thinking about deforestation as this global challenge, because it affects all of the globe. Even if forests have geography, their benefits, in fact, do not, whether they are in terms of species, whether they are in terms of geography, those are common. So let me ask this last question to both of you, Anukul and then Les. If you had a magic tree or whatever, or a wand, and could do one thing today, right now, or have leaders of the world do one thing today that would help the future of global forests and deforestation in the direction both of you have been talking about, what would that be? Anukul first and then Les. If you could do one thing, what would that one thing?
I would say that, there aren't any silver bullets here. I mean, if there were, we would have long used them. I think it's really a matter of taking many lead bullets and then kind of making sure that they work in synchrony and harmony together. So, I wouldn't say there is just one thing. Again, 5 years ago, I would have said, hey, we got to be doing more in terms of preserving our forests from a government level. There's got to be more subsidies. There's got to be more replanting. There's got to be more, hazardous fuel reduction. But I feel like it's no longer like the awareness of the problem isn't there. I don't think it's anymore that the funding isn't there. I feel like all of these vehicles are already moving. I think what now has to happen is it has to go from, policy and large kind of aggregate government international level to down to the local community. So if there's one thing, if I kind of come back to your question, it would be much more local, community-based, sustainable kind of reimagining of how one can live with fire, how one can live with forest. And that, I think, is a mantle that kind of falls on all of us. It falls on private enterprise. It certainly requires local and state, but it also falls on NGOs and nonprofits to catalyze local community work, whether that be in better sustainable farming practices.
Yeah, I would do one thing at the other end of the spectrum. Presuming we do what Anacol said, I would require that forests and indeed all of natural capital be part of the GDP of every country, that it be counted. I think that would change the global economy without fundamentally rewiring the way it works and deal with a good deal of this equity issue.
Thank you. I think both of those are really, really good examples. And actually, it's good that they're at the two ends. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Les Kaufman. Thank you so much, Anukul. Thank you to everyone who's been here. I hope that this has been useful. I hope that some of the words that you take with you from today, high up on that is humility, to think as a species and to think of our superpowers with the respect that they deserve and the responsibility that they bring with them, rather than with the arrogance of control, which we actually do not have. I hope you take away this idea that you have a superpower, as was mentioned here, of imagining a better future. But you also have a super responsibility of not simply imagining, but turning it into a reality. And finally, sort of at a technocratic level, I hope people take from this conversation that much as we think about forests in very utilitarian terms, they are the trees which give me paper, they are the packaging in which my Amazon box comes in, they are the cool side of the chair that I love, or they are simply a way of nature to deal with my gunk in terms of being a sink. To think of forests as a living system in itself, and a system that not only deserves to live, but without which we may not be able to. So in all of those ways, I hope this has been useful. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you. Please join me in thanking both of our speakers. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.